Imagine the year as 216 BC. The Roman Republic stands tall, its legions feared across the known world. Soldiers in gleaming armor march in perfect formation, their discipline unmatched, their power unquestioned. To most, facing Rome on the battlefield meant certain death. But on this day, something unthinkable happened. One warlord, outnumbered, out-equipped, and seemingly cornered, dared to defy the empire's greatest army. And instead of charging with brute force, he relied on something far deadlier: his mind. With a single masterstroke of deception, he transformed weakness into strength, lured Rome's finest into a deadly trap, and unleashed a tactic so brilliant that it shattered their pride and left their legions in ruins. This was not just a battle. It was a lesson in genius, a reminder that even the mightiest empire can be humbled by one man's cunning. Today, we uncover the story of the warlord who outsmarted Rome's greatest army, using just one trick: setting the stage, Rome's might and arrogance. Before we can understand the brilliance of the warlord's trick, we must first understand the giant he dared to challenge. Rome. By the 3rd century BC, the Roman Republic had transformed itself into the supreme military machine of the Mediterranean. Its armies, known as the legions, were not just soldiers, they were professionals of war. Each legion was a finely tuned instrument of destruction, disciplined in formation, unmatched in organization, and forged by countless battles. The Roman strategy was simple but devastating: overwhelm the enemy with sheer manpower and discipline. Rome could lose battles and still come back stronger, because its real strength lay in numbers and determination. Defeat was temporary, but victory for Rome was permanent. The legions marched like clockwork. Their square formations, heavy shields, short stabbing swords, and unwavering cohesion had crushed kingdoms, tribes, and rival empires. From Spain to Greece, from Carthage to Gaul, the world had begun to accept a simple truth: to face Rome in open battle was to court destruction. And yet, Rome's greatest strength carried within it a hidden weakness: arrogance. The Roman Senate and generals often believed their way of war was superior to all others. Their mindset was, "We are Rome. We are invincible." This confidence sometimes blinded them to unconventional tactics, to the possibility that an enemy might not fight on their terms. It was in this moment of Roman dominance, when their pride towered as high as their power, that a warlord rose. He did not have Rome's numbers. He did not have their resources. But he had something far more dangerous: the ability to think differently. This clash was not going to be a contest of muscle, but of minds. And as history would show, Rome was about to learn a painful lesson: numbers and discipline mean nothing if you march straight into a trap. The rise of Hannibal, Rome's greatest nightmare. To truly understand how Rome was outsmarted, we must meet the man behind the plan, Hannibal Barca. Born in 247 BC in the powerful North African city of Carthage, Hannibal was raised in a family that lived and breathed war. His father, Hamilcar Barca, was one of Carthage's greatest generals during the First Punic War against Rome. From a young age, Hannibal witnessed the devastating power of Rome and the humiliation his people suffered after their defeat. According to legend, before Hannibal was even 10 years old, his father made him swear an oath, with his hand placed upon a sacrificial altar, that he would never be a friend of Rome, but an eternal enemy. This vow would shape his entire life. From childhood, Hannibal was trained not only in warfare but also in endurance, strategy, and leadership. He grew up mastering both the sword and the mind, learning to inspire loyalty in men of many nations. Unlike Rome, which relied mainly on its own citizens, Hannibal's armies were a mix of Africans, Iberians, Gauls, and mercenaries. He knew how to unite them under a single purpose: his burning hatred of Rome. When Hannibal became commander of the Carthaginian forces in Spain, he wasted no time proving his brilliance. He captured Roman allied cities, crushed local tribes, and expanded Carthage's influence. But Rome could not ignore him for long. Tensions between Rome and Carthage boiled over once again, sparking the Second Punic War in 218 BC. It was here that Hannibal made a move so audacious, so bold, that it would go down in history as one of the greatest feats of military daring. Instead of waiting for Rome to bring the war to him, Hannibal brought the war to Rome's doorstep. With an army of nearly 50,000 men, thousands of horses, and war elephants, Hannibal marched from Spain, across the Pyrenees through hostile Gaul, and into the icy, deadly Alps. The Romans thought it impossible, suicide even, but Hannibal defied the odds. His army suffered, losing men and elephants in the brutal journey, yet he emerged into Italy with a battle-hardened force, ready to strike. This single act shocked Rome to its core. For centuries, no enemy had dared to invade the Italian heartland. Rome's arrogance had led them to believe that their homeland was untouchable. Hannibal shattered that illusion in one stroke. And he didn't stop there. In the battles that followed, Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and countless skirmishes, Hannibal displayed his genius. He destroyed Roman armies again and again, proving that discipline and numbers meant nothing against cunning strategy. But all of this was leading to one fateful day, the climax of Hannibal's campaign, the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. Here, Hannibal would not just defeat Rome, he would humiliate them with a trick so brilliant that military schools still study it over 2,000 years later. Rome's overconfidence, marching toward disaster. By the year 216 BC, the Roman Republic was at a breaking point. Hannibal Barca had been in Italy for 2 years, and in that short time, he had humiliated the mighty legions again and again. At the Battle of Trebia, Hannibal lured a Roman army into icy rivers and ambushed them with hidden troops. At Lake Trasimene, he set up one of the largest ambushes in history, killing thousands and even capturing a Roman consul. Rome had never faced an enemy like this before, a man who fought with deception, speed, and genius. But instead of learning humility, Rome's response was pride. The Senate could not tolerate more losses. Citizens of Rome demanded revenge. Their allies across Italy began doubting Roman protection, and whispers spread that maybe Hannibal would succeed in breaking Rome's power. The Senate decided that the only way to restore confidence was to crush Hannibal once and for all in open battle. So they made a decision that would change history, to raise the largest Roman army ever assembled. Nearly 80,000 Roman infantry and 6,000 cavalry were gathered, a force so large that people said the earth trembled beneath their march. They recruited not just Roman citizens but also Italian allies, eager to prove Rome's might. This army was nearly double the size of Hannibal's. To many, it looked like an unstoppable machine. 2 consuls were placed in command, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Normally, Rome appointed consuls with different temperaments so they could balance one another. But this time, their differences would prove deadly. Paulus was cautious. He respected Hannibal's brilliance and feared falling into another trap. Varro, on the other hand, was reckless and hot-headed. He wanted glory, fame, and a swift end to the war. He despised caution, believing it was cowardice. Since the consuls alternated command each day, the army's fate depended on who was in charge on the day of battle. That gamble would prove disastrous. Meanwhile, among the Roman soldiers, morale was high. Picture it, tens of thousands of men marching in perfect rows, their armor shining under the Italian sun, banners waving, trumpets blaring. They were confident, almost arrogant. This time, they thought, Hannibal cannot escape us. He is outnumbered, outmatched, and out of options. But here is the irony: the very size of this army, their greatest strength, would soon become their greatest weakness. Hannibal knew how Romans thought. He knew their pride, their desire for decisive battle, and above all, their belief that sheer numbers guaranteed victory. He had been studying them for years, predicting their moves before they even made them. And now, with this massive army marching toward him, Hannibal saw not danger, but opportunity. He deliberately led them to a place called Cannae, in southern Italy. To the Romans, it was simply a convenient supply depot. But to Hannibal, it was the perfect battlefield. The plains around Cannae were wide and open, which gave his cavalry the space they needed to maneuver. At the same time, the dusty, dry winds of summer would blow directly into the faces of the Romans. These subtle choices were not accidents. Hannibal was shaping the battlefield like a sculptor shapes stone. Rome, blinded by overconfidence, didn't notice. They believed they had cornered Hannibal at last. The senators, the consuls, the soldiers. All of Rome was convinced that this would be their moment of triumph, the final crushing blow that would restore Roman honor. What they didn't realize was this: they were not marching toward victory. They were marching into the deadliest trap in Roman history. Because Hannibal had prepared something so cunning, so perfectly timed, that Rome's greatest army would not just lose, it would be annihilated. The setup at Cannae, Hannibal's trap, is ready. The stage was set in the summer of 216 BC, near a small town called Cannae in southern Italy. On one side stood the might of Rome, nearly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, the largest army they had ever put into the field. On the other stood Hannibal, with only about 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The numbers told one story: Rome should have won easily. But Hannibal was about to write a very different ending. Rome's formation. The Romans followed their usual strategy: brute force. They arranged their legions in a deep, massive block of infantry. The idea was simple: smash through the Carthaginian line with overwhelming manpower. Their formation was tight, almost too tight, like a giant fist ready to punch through the enemy's center. Behind them, cavalry guarded the flanks, though Roman cavalry was not their strength. Rome had always relied on infantry discipline to win battles. Hannibal's formation. Hannibal, however, did something unusual, something no Roman expected. Instead of putting his strongest troops at the center, he placed his weaker, less reliable Gaulish and Iberian infantry there. But he arranged them in a curved, outward-facing arc, bulging toward the Romans. Why? Because Hannibal wanted the Romans to attack the center. He was inviting them in. On the flanks, hidden behind this bulge, Hannibal placed his strongest African infantry, disciplined veterans armed with Roman-style equipment taken from previous victories. These men were not meant to fight immediately. They were waiting for the perfect moment. And on the wings, Hannibal's real advantage stood ready: his cavalry. The Numidian horsemen, famous for their speed and hit-and-run tactics, and the Iberian cavalry, fierce and skilled. Unlike Rome, Hannibal trusted his cavalry as his strike force. The environmental advantage: Hannibal even used nature itself as a weapon. The battlefield at Cannae was flat, dusty, and exposed to hot summer winds. As the Roman army advanced, the wind blew directly into their faces, filling the air with choking dust and blinding their vision. Hannibal's troops, facing the opposite direction, had clear sight. Even the smallest details were on Hannibal's side. The psychological trap. The Romans, seeing the bulging Carthaginian center, thought it was weakness. To them, this looked like an army about to break. They believed that with one powerful push, they would finally crush Hannibal. The soldiers cheered, confident that the gods had handed them victory. But that was exactly what Hannibal wanted. The weak center was bait. The Romans were walking straight into his design, unaware they were stepping into a deadly trap that would soon close around them like jaws. By dawn on the day of the battle, both armies stood ready. Dust rose into the air, spears and shields glinted in the sunlight, and tens of thousands of men braced for combat. The Romans thought they were about to win their greatest victory. Hannibal knew he was about to deliver their greatest defeat. The battle begins. Hannibal's one trick revealed. The sun rose over the dusty plains of Cannae. Tension filled the air as tens of thousands of men braced for combat. On one side, the Romans stood shoulder to shoulder, packed tightly into their massive formation, 80,000 infantry crammed together like a solid wall of steel. On the other side, Hannibal's army spread out, appearing weaker, thinner, more fragile. The signal horns sounded. The ground shook. The Battle of Cannae had begun. The Roman advance. As expected, the Romans pushed forward with their overwhelming numbers, driving straight into the bulging Carthaginian center. Their plan was simple: smash through quickly, scatter Hannibal's troops, and end the war in one decisive blow. At first, it looked like the Romans were succeeding. Hannibal's Gaulish and Iberian infantry in the center gave ground slowly, step by step. The bulge in their line began to fold inward under the crushing Roman advance. To Roman eyes, this was victory. The enemy center was collapsing. Their cheers grew louder. The consuls believed the gods had answered their prayers. But this collapse wasn't weakness. It was part of Hannibal's design. The trap tightens. The Carthaginian center deliberately retreated. They did so in perfect coordination, bending inward in the shape of a crescent moon. The Romans kept pressing forward, eager to break through, but as they did, they pushed deeper and deeper into the trap. At the same time, Hannibal's African infantry on the flanks, who had been waiting silently, suddenly pivoted inward. Like two great doors swinging shut, they closed around the Roman sides. Now, the massive Roman army was no longer pressing an enemy. They were being squeezed from the left and right. The cavalry strikes. But the trap wasn't complete yet. On the wings, Hannibal's cavalry had been fighting Rome's horsemen. The Carthaginian and Numidian riders, more skilled and aggressive, quickly overwhelmed the Roman cavalry. Once the Roman horsemen fled the field, Hannibal's cavalry wheeled around and charged straight into the back of the Roman infantry. Now the Romans were trapped on all sides, front, left, right and rear. The encirclement. This was Hannibal's one trick, the double envelopment maneuver, or what historians call the pincer movement. For the first time in history, an entire army, larger, stronger, more disciplined, had been completely surrounded on the battlefield. The Romans had walked straight into the jaws of Hannibal's trap, and there was no escape. Packed tightly together, unable to maneuver, their numbers became a curse. Soldiers in the back could not even swing their swords. Dust choked the air, blood slicked the ground, and panic spread like wildfire. Hannibal had turned Rome's strength into its weakness. The slaughter what followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Hour after hour, the Carthaginians cut down the trapped Romans. By the end of the day, an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, the greatest single-day loss in Rome's history. Consul Paulus was killed, while Varro escaped with only a handful of survivors. Rome's pride had been shattered. Their invincible legions had been annihilated in one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers the world had ever seen. The trick that shook Rome. And now, we arrive at the moment that defines Hannibal's genius. It wasn't brute force, it wasn't superior weapons, it was deception. Hannibal understood one thing better than anyone else. Rome's pride was its greatest weakness. The Roman generals believed they could overwhelm any enemy with sheer numbers. So, Hannibal devised a plan that turned their confidence into their doom. He set his troops in a way no Roman had ever seen before. In the center of his line, he placed his weakest soldiers, the Gauls and Spaniards. To any Roman eye, it looked like a foolish mistake. Why put the weakest fighters in the most exposed position? Surely, they would collapse at the first charge. And that is exactly what Hannibal wanted them to believe. As the Romans charged forward with their massive legions, they smashed into the Carthaginian center. Slowly, deliberately, Hannibal's center began to bend backward, retreating just enough to make it look like the Romans were winning. The enemy pushed harder, pouring more men into the center, believing victory was within their grasp. But here was the trap. While the Romans surged inward, Hannibal's African heavy infantry, his most disciplined and experienced soldiers, waited silently on the flanks. The moment was critical. As the Roman lines grew stretched and disorderly, Hannibal gave the signal. His flanks suddenly closed in like a giant set of jaws, and then came the cavalry. Hannibal's horsemen, who had driven off the Roman cavalry earlier in the battle, swung around and struck from behind. In an instant, the Romans were surrounded, trapped in a deadly circle with no escape. What looked like Hannibal's weakness had been his greatest strength. This was the famous double envelopment, a maneuver so bold and precise that military leaders still study it over 2,000 years later. By the end of the day, nearly 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead or captured. It was not just a defeat, it was a massacre, the worst in Roman history. One trick, one brilliant deception, had shattered the might of Rome's greatest army. Rome's nightmare and Hannibal's mischance. When news of the disaster at Cannae reached Rome, the city was plunged into shock and despair. Never before had the Republic suffered such a catastrophic defeat. Families wept as tens of thousands of Roman sons and fathers would never return home. The Senate prepared for the worst, fearing Hannibal would march straight to the gates of Rome. But here's where history takes a fascinating twist. Hannibal, despite his genius on the battlefield, did not attack the city itself. Some say he lacked the siege equipment needed to take fortified Rome. Others argue he believed Rome would collapse on its own after such devastation. His allies urged him to strike, insisting that Rome was vulnerable. But Hannibal chose caution, waiting for the Republic to crumble from within. Rome, however, was not so easily broken. Unlike other powers Hannibal had crushed, Rome had an iron will. Instead of surrendering, the Senate raised new armies, restructured its command, and adapted its tactics. The Republic learned from its mistakes, and slowly, painfully it began to push back. For Hannibal, Cannae was the peak of his brilliance. Though he fought on for years, he would never again win such a crushing victory. History remembers him not only as Rome's deadliest enemy, but also as the man who revealed the truth about war, that intelligence, patience, and cunning can be more powerful than sheer numbers. The Battle of Cannae remains one of the most studied battles in history, a lesson in strategy, psychology, and the dangers of arrogance. Hannibal's trick reshaped the art of warfare, inspiring generals from Napoleon to modern military academies. But perhaps the greatest lesson is this: even the mightiest power can fall when it underestimates a clever enemy. Hannibal's name endures because he proved that brilliance can humble even an empire as vast as Rome. So the question is, was Hannibal truly Rome's greatest nightmare, or was he a genius whose caution cost him ultimate victory? History leaves us to wonder.